Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, executive editor of TNSR. The fox is guarding the henhouse. This is a way many people might characterize the United Nations as it comes to the topic of human rights. The formation of the United Nations Human Rights Council, which replaced the previous Commission on Human Rights in 2006, is certainly a great example of this. Among the Council's 47 members are China, Russia, Cuba, and Venezuela, nations whose record on human rights is hardly exemplary. In this week's episode of Horns, Dr. Rana Inboden discusses China's role in the creation of the Human Rights Council and the institution-building process, including the strenuous efforts that China went to shape the process in order to minimize the type of public criticism that it would undergo based on its human rights record. While it's possible to view this as an indictment of the hypocrisy of the UN system, a more interesting question to ask after listening to Inboden's detailed description of the lengths that China went to in order to avoid wearing a mark of opposition to human rights, even as it sought to undermine the strength of the system, is if the human rights regime is as weak as many suppose, why would a state like China put so much effort into trying to ensure that they are free from constraints that come from it? Keeping this question in mind, it's fascinating to listen to the history of how China seeks to shape and control a regime which itself ought to be shaping and controlling China's action. Let's listen in.
Well, welcome to this event on China and the global human rights regime, which is hosted today by UT's Asia Policy Program and the Center for East Asian Studies. The Asia Policy Program was established last year as a joint initiative of the Clement Center for National Security and the Strauss Center for International Security and Law. And it is intended to do some work on campus to address the region's increasing importance in American foreign policy, national security, international security, and global politics. So we foster research, dialogue, and education about policy-relevant developments and questions in the Indo-Pacific, in part through our speaker series, where scholars and practitioners and policymakers join us to discuss current important policy issues in Asia. And so today's event is part of that series. Our co-host, the Center for East Asian Studies, and I think Kirsten Cather, the director of that center, was unable to join us at the last minute, but we're very grateful to them for co-hosting the event. Promotes research and teaching across campus related to East Asian cultures and societies, and fosters interdisciplinary collaboration on East Asia across a dozen different UT departments. So if you're here through one of those, thank you very much, and we're glad to have you join us today. We're really delighted to welcome Dr. Rana Inboden today to speak on a topic that's drawn a lot of attention in global politics in the last several years. Dr. Inboden will speak for about 35 or 40 minutes, and then we'll open up to question and answers and some discussion with all of you. So let me just briefly introduce her. I really can't think of a better person and a more knowledgeable expert to talk about these issues today, and her book is amazing and terrific, so I hope you all will have a chance to check it out. Dr. Inboden is a senior fellow with the Robert Strauss Center on International Security and Law at the University of Texas at Austin. She serves as a consultant on human rights and democracy and rule of law projects in Asia for a number of different non-governmental organizations and conducts research related to international human rights, Chinese foreign policy, and the effectiveness of international human rights and democracy projects, as well as authoritarian collaboration in the United Nations, which is what she'll talk primarily about today. Her first book is China and the International Human Rights Regime. It came out last year with Cambridge University Press, and it examines how China has engaged on human rights questions, particularly in the United Nations, between 1982 and 2017. Dr. Inboden has a distinguished career in public service. She served in the U.S. State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, where her primary responsibilities were for managing the State Department's Human Rights and Democracy Fund China program, and promoting U.S. human rights and democracy policy in China and North Korea. She served at the United States Consulate in Shanghai, in the Office of Chinese and Mongolian Affairs, and in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research at the U.S. State Department. She holds a DPhil from the Department of Politics and International Relations at Oxford University, an MA at Stanford University in East Asian Studies, and a bachelor's from the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. And she's won awards from the State Department for her work on human rights and democracy promotion. So as a scholar and a policymaker, I really am grateful that you agreed to join us and talk about your work and your expertise today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rana Inboden.
I asked the question, what role has China played in the international human rights regime? And by regime, I use scholar Stephen Krasner's definition of principles, norms, rules, and decision-making procedures around which actor expectations converge in a given issue area. And so in the international human rights regime, this primarily relates to the UN. The UN's primary human rights body is the UN Human Rights Council, and that's the chapter I actually decided to focus on today because it gives us such a great vantage point to look at how China views the international human rights regime. The book stops off at 2017, which is a useful inflection point, given that there has been a shift under Xi Jinping to a much more muscular posture. But we can't really know where we're going with China until we know where we've come from with China. And as I said, this chapter focuses on the creation of the Human Rights Council. That procedure primarily took place from 2004 to 2007. And some of the benefits of thinking about China in this way includes I developed 5 possible state roles that could be played in an international regime. Previous scholarship focused on the binary question of is China compliant or not with regard to human rights. And then also I have a number of diverse case studies. One of the chapters also addresses the labor rights organizations, as well as you'll see that the audience, the size of the audience, the institutional design of the different bodies matters a lot with regard to how China behaves. My sources ranged from documents, including copious numbers of UN documents, as well as interviews with over 70 diplomats, including from a variety of regions, and as well as human rights NGO activists and civil society participants and UN officials. I will acknowledge a tiny bit of bias in that even though I reached out broadly to a number of people from different regions, including China, I, not surprisingly, had difficulty obtaining interviews with Chinese diplomats as well as Cuban ones. I see a couple people smirking. They probably understand, whereas Western European and North American diplomats, just the level of transparency with those governments is much greater. And this question is attentive to not only to observing China's behavior, but also trying to decipher China's motivations. And so this is the UN Human Rights a picture of the new UN Human Rights Council. New meaning, even though it was created in 2006, it's new in terms of the UN landscape. Institutional reform in the UN happens so infrequently that the creation of a new body is a great chance to look at China's priorities in the UN as it relates to human rights. So this council replaced the UN Commission on Human Rights. That had been in existence for 60 years, but over time it became increasingly discredited, partly because countries like Libya and Sudan could get elected. It caused Human Rights Watch to call it, quote, a rogues gallery of human rights abusers. And so support from a number of different actors grew. It started with, in 2005, there was the largest gathering of world leaders at the time, the World Summit. And so delivering a new Human Rights Council was a key deliverable for the world leaders at that time. After that was announced in 2005, the UN General Assembly followed up with a resolution in 2006. And then because it was a very contentious process, the UN General Assembly resolution left a lot of questions unanswered. It did create a new body, but a lot of the tiny details about what makes an organization effective or not were left open to the new members of the Human Rights Council to take up. So during that first year, member states participated in what is called an institution building process, where in Geneva, the discussions focused on these final details. And you'll see that there were some interesting positions that China took. So China, and I will handle it in terms of starting with a little bit of background. So China and the creation of the Human Rights Council, it provides an unparalleled glimpse into China's positions, partly because during that first year of the council from 2006 to 2007, almost every aspect of the international human rights regime was reviewed during the institution building process. It also demonstrates what I call China's stealth constrainer strategies. By stealth, I mean that China, in numerous instances, tried to obscure its opposition. It tried to, even if it had key imperatives that it wanted to see realized, they did so in a very low-key way. They either avoided leading an effort, let some of their other friends like Cuba, Russia, or Pakistan lead an effort while quietly supporting it. They also contained their vigorous positions to smaller meetings and especially meetings where there wouldn't necessarily be a written record. And they reserved their most assertive positions when there were clear red lines with regard to their interests. Some of this has to be situated in terms of what happened after the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre, where China came under much more vigorous scrutiny, not necessarily consistent scrutiny, but enough that China was really put off by that. And in the Commission on Human Rights, China faced a resolution every year between 1989 and 2005, except those years. And those exceptions were either because the necessity of securing China's cooperation on something like the Gulf War, or some of those years, 2002, 2003, there were sufficient areas where China was being cooperative, or it had released a number of prisoners that it was felt that other countries could forego sponsoring a resolution. In 1989 and 1991, the subcommission, which was made up of experts, and it reported to the UN Commission on Human Rights, passed resolutions. The composition of that body is very important because those were non-governmental experts, and so they maybe weren't quite as beholden to considering state power or state-to-state relations. And so that's why in many instances you see bodies of experts or experts serving in the UN human rights regime outside of their national origin, often playing a much more effective role than member states can. As I mentioned, China acted as a constrainer, largely by trying to prevent the Council from emerging as a more forceful entity than the Commission on Human Rights. So during the early phase, of reform, China was initially very hesitant. It had, even though it didn't like the attention that the Commission had given to it, in the form of introduction of country-specific resolutions that detailed China's human rights abuses, even though those resolutions never passed because China could work with Pakistan or Cuba to thwart the passage of those resolutions, China never liked that it had to even face the specter of those resolutions. But they were also easily able to defeat the resolutions. There was only 1 year where it came close and where they lost by 1 vote. So China even had become comfortable and content with the Commission and was very concerned that the Council could become a body with greater teeth. China's key positions during this time included resisting any membership criteria. So recall that Libya and Sudan had been elected to the Commission. China and some other countries also opposed any kind of criteria with regard to human rights. There had also been a proposal to set a higher bar for election, so required a two-thirds vote. China also resisted this. And China also brought up its historic opposition to country-specific scrutiny, using the opportunity to complain about country-specific resolutions as being confrontational and naming and shaming. China also endorsed a larger body so that there would be greater representation for countries from Asia and Africa, where China historically has drawn most of its support from. And then finally, there were discussions about elevating the Human Rights Council's status to be on par with the Security Council, thereby giving human rights a bit more heft within the UN. And China also opposed this. China's key conduct and strategies during this time, they quietly resisted endorsing the proposed council. In private meetings, including with the highest level UN officials, China would quietly say, we don't like this idea. They would try to kill it, but they resisted having a public record of this position. They were one of the last holdouts to accept the Human Rights Council as a World Summit deliverable, and they let Pakistan and Russia and others take the lead. At times, this appeared to result in a little bit of friction, especially with Russia, where Russia would kind of say, you have to carry part of this image burden. But as momentum continued and China saw that the council was probably going to come into being, instead of opposing it and withdrawing from discussions, they became more engaged because their calculus was that if this is going to be a reality, we need to shape it and make sure that we are engaged in on almost every aspect where we can weigh in. These two quotes, so Ambassador Xia Zukang, I think show some tension. Xia Zukang said the resolution is not perfect, but it is a compromise that can be accepted by all UN members, so China hopes it can be adopted. So fairly positive to neutral, whereas Ambassador Zhang Yishan said the resolution has failed to fully reflect the concerns of many developing countries, including China, over some issues. First, it does not provide effective guarantee to prevent the political confrontation caused by the country-specific resolution, which has become a chronic disease of the Commission on Human Rights. And so in Ambassador Zhang's statement, you can actually see one of China's strategies coming out where it tries to frame its positions within a group of other countries, especially the developing world. So now that the resolution has been created, the UN General Assembly resolution has now created the Human Rights Council. Now we're in 2006, and the action moves from New York to Geneva, where China sought, according to one NGO participant, a dilution of the procedures, role, and impact of the Human Rights Council, and then China systematically participated in all of the meetings to discuss everybody. China also, again, as in previous times, tried to obscure its opposition and constraining attempts, and it preferred to let other countries take more visible roles. Here, the like-minded group becomes very important to China's strategies. The like-minded group is largely drawn from developing world countries. I sometimes call it a group of authoritarian thugs, but that's a bit too simplistic, even though it's ear-catching. Some of these countries, not all of them are truly authoritarian, but I would say 90% of the ones that belong to the like-minded group have marred human rights records. And you could consider the like-minded group a subset of the non-aligned movement or the global south. These countries often oppose country-specific scrutiny, but part of their opposition to some of the aspects of a stronger Human Rights Council also draw from a kind of us versus them, us being the developing world and them being the developed Western world. And the like-minded group actually first emerged in the late 1990s. They were in the Commission on Human Rights, and the first statement is actually delivered in 1999 by Pakistan. One of my other chapters also focuses on some discussions over torture protocols to prevent torture and create a visiting mechanism. And in that group, there was also a subset of countries that then became part of the like-minded group, and that included Cuba, Algeria, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Syria, and China. After 1999, in the Commission, the like-minded group grew to 23 countries. And surprisingly, China is not described as being a key leader of the like-minded group at this point in time. It is actually not until 2012 when the like-minded group reemerges in the Human Rights Council, that China plays a more leadership role. But, and as I mentioned earlier, that China often preferred to let Russia, Pakistan, or even Cuba kind of have to front an opposition effort. Well, in this case, China actually had to make a number of statements because they took their rotational turn serving as the like-minded group state's spokesperson. And so China actually, this in some ways worked in China's favor. Even though they don't like the attention and the visibility, it also let them shape the like-minded group's statements to be very closely aligned to their prerogatives. But I will note that during the institution building process, which again was a year-long process, as I was going over the UN statements and going over copious amounts of documents, I did come across what I think shows interesting tension where the like-minded group had been making statements, and in November 2016, there's a statement that the typed version is framed as offering the statement on behalf of the like-minded group, but there's handwriting scratching out like-minded group to China only. And then in the UN documents, it's filed as a China statement. Based on my experience as a former diplomat, I think that Chinese diplomats drafted it hoping that the like-minded group would sign off on it. And then when they realized that there wasn't enough support for that statement, they had to change it to a China-only statement. This also tracks with something important that was happening at the time, which is that because the representation for the developing world, especially Asia and Africa, had expanded from the Commission to the Council, these countries that had belonged to the like-minded group felt less pressure to continue organizing and presenting their statements together. And so some of the group's cohesion was being lost, not so much because they didn't still share the same positions, but more because they felt that they had safety in numbers. They could control the voting outcomes in the Human Rights Council. And so you see that the like-minded group disbands, and they do not resurrect until 2012. And one of the reasons they eventually resurrect is because, and I don't think I'm biased in saying this, but the US re-engaged with the Council, and the Human Rights Council actually started becoming more effective. And in response, the like-minded group felt a lot more threatened by more country-specific scrutiny, by efforts to focus on countries for their human rights abuses. Whereas the first, from about 2006 to 2011, the Council, some people described it as there were a few diplomats who called it essentially a non-entity. But you'll see that there were still a number of equities that a number of countries, especially China, were bickering over during the first year. So this is 2006 to 2007, and the Council is a reality. But as I mentioned, many of the key questions about how the Council would function were left unanswered in the UN General Assembly resolution that created the Council. So China's positions at this time largely related to trying to hold back these different aspects of the human rights regime from emerging as stronger. One of the key areas was the special procedures. This is a part of the UN that invites experts, mainly scholars or NGO activists, to serve in an independent capacity, either focusing on specific countries or on thematic issues. So, for example, Cuba, Belarus, Sudan have all had special procedures created specifically to focus on their records. There's also a range of experts who work on everything from women's rights to torture to religious freedom. And in many ways, this is one of the stronger parts of the UN human rights regime. As I said, because they serve in their personal capacities, they can often act without concern about state-to-state relations. These experts also, they do a couple of different things. They write to states and bring up cases of concern. They also issue reports drawing attention to human rights abuses, but crucially, they also conduct investigative visits to countries. So they are often called the crown jewel of the UN human rights system. One of China's positions included supporting a full review of all of the mandates with the idea of eliminating some of them. Algeria had suggested a code of conduct to, quote unquote, keep the these UN experts in line. And so shifting the onus for states to cooperate, but rather saying some of these experts go beyond their mandate, and so we have to constrain them with a code of conduct. China also underscored the need that these experts have to have a constructive and cooperative attitude, suggesting that they did not. China also resisted the idea that states should issue a standing invitation so that these experts would be welcome to come. China has usually engaged in very protracted negotiations over any visits, and I think to date, China has only accepted about 5 or 6 visits over a 20-year period. China also overall wanted to give states greater control over those visits and also the final reports that those mandate holders would issue. There's also been very extensive reporting on how China behaves during those visits. As I mentioned, the 5 or 6 visits that China has accepted, it would do things like follow the expert and their staff, tell different members within China's civil society that they were not allowed to meet with the person. There have also been instances where China concocted reasons such as weather and national security concerns so that the planned schedule of meetings couldn't take place. So China has a lot of suspicion and hostility towards these experts. It caused there was a special rapporteur about 5 years ago who focused on poverty, which is an area where China should be able to say it has a relatively good record on. But because China was so nervous about the final report and interfered with the visits so extensively, that rapporteur made a press conference at the conclusion of his visits detailing some of the ways that the Chinese government had interfered with his visit. China also took on the Universal Periodic Review. That was one of the new monitoring mechanisms that was suggested when the Human Rights Council was being proposed and discussed. The idea was that instead of kind of relying on selective scrutiny or sufficient support among member states, that there would be a regular system where all states would be reviewed about every 3 to 4 years. This made China very nervous. When the idea was first suggested, China really tried to prevent it from emerging. And then when it was clear that there was a lot of support for it, they insisted that it be a peer review. So no NGO, so trying to limit NGO participation. Because China is just much more comfortable with state-to-state relations, partly because it has mastered very much how to talk to other states about what they should and should not say in the UN human rights system about China's role. China also insisted that the whole review be based on state cooperation, emphasized dialogue and cooperation over any kind of binding action for non-compliant states or states where the review turned up some serious human rights concerns. And so China really tried to keep this a fairly toothless exercise, which it has largely succeeded in doing. I mentioned the subcommission earlier, which in 1989 and 1991 had managed to pass resolutions on China's human rights record. Here, China even before this began an assault on that body, and China continued it so that it made sure it was a subsidiary expert body. It even was renamed to the advisory committee. And the the experts on that body have much more restricted authority, and their mandate has shrunk so that states are not any country that has been brought up in the Human Rights Council should not be taken up by the subcommission or the advisory body. Also, the advisory body cannot take up any areas of study unless expressly approved by the member states of the Human Rights Council. So very much constraining what these individual experts can use in terms of their tools. The complaints procedure, there has for many years been a very cumbersome complaints procedure whereby individuals can report human rights abuses. It's so cumbersome that by some measures it takes about 18 months for adjudication. And there has historically been very little publicity around it, so that it's usually, instead of being discussed by the whole Human Rights Council, those complaints are taken up by smaller committees composed of states with very little audience participating in those proceedings. China really wanted to keep it a toothless and weak mechanism. And so China also started off by challenging the necessity of it, saying, now that we have the Universal Periodic Review, maybe we should even just get rid of this. But failing that, it sought to at least ensure that the process remained extremely lengthy. So again, by some measures, it's now almost 2 years. And then they sought to minimize any pressure on states, ensure that the complaints were confidential so that the broader Human Rights Council would not necessarily know there's been 100 complaints filed on China or something like that. And China sought to give states strong influence over the composition of the groups of the group that would review the complaints. So China wanted it to be mainly member states where the people sitting on those committees sat in their official capacity, not in a independent personal capacity or professional capacity. And then China also, even if there were going to be experts that were allowed to help review the complaints, China wanted states to be allowed to elect those people, those individuals, instead of allowing the UN Commissioner for Human Rights, who is the UN's highest official and serves in their independent capacity. China did not want to let that office select experts because the idea was that China feared that they would select individuals who favored vigorous human rights monitoring instead of giving states a pass. This is where you think dissertation research is boring, but it's really not. It's very exciting and fun. So China and country resolutions, I've mentioned how much China opposed those. And so what happened was China, even from the very beginning of the discussions, kept saying, we should get rid of country-specific scrutiny. We should get rid of resolutions. We should get rid of any hearings focused on an individual country, and we should get rid of special procedures focused on countries. And in fact, China was one of the countries that helped support getting rid of in 2006, getting rid of the special procedures focused on Belarus and Cuba. But China also sees this as an opportunity. And so it kept bringing up in the institution building process where the working groups often met during the Human Rights Council, but they also met throughout the year, almost on a monthly basis, to kind of try to get states aligned on what the final text would look like. And China repeatedly kept opposing country resolutions and specifically proposed, okay, if we have to have country-specific resolutions, they need to only be passed by a 2/3 majority of the Human Rights Council, which is a fairly high bar. They also said 1/3 of the members have to sponsor a country-specific resolution, even to get it to the table, another high bar, which would have essentially strangled the Human Rights Council's ability to use any country-specific scrutiny. And if you read all of the text You can see China repeatedly making these points, but it wasn't clear how much of a red line this was until we get to the last working group session in April 2007, where China had made very strong opposition to the text that included the ability for the Human Rights Council to use country-specific scrutiny. And it still wasn't taken up because not a lot of other countries supported China's position. So we get to the plenary of the Human Rights Council, where this institution building process that has taken a year and is the first major thing that the Human Rights Council needs to pass. And it's now midnight, and the discussions have been led by Ambassador de Alba of Mexico, who, by many accounts, was a very effective negotiator and facilitator. But at the last minute, China refused to accept the text. And so everyone's sitting in the plenary session, and China is refusing to accept it. The UN Human Rights Council really wanted to pass their first major piece, their first major resolution by consensus. They could have gone to a vote where China, maybe one other country might have voted with China, but they really wanted it by consensus. And so Ambassador de Alba stayed up past midnight with all the plenary kind of waiting in the building and was negotiating with the Chinese, who were calling back to Beijing to get final instructions on if they could relent. And it got so comical that the Mexican mission had hired a mariachi band to celebrate the passage of the institution building package, and the band on cue started playing at what was supposed to be the reception, and the Mexican diplomats had to run out and be like, no, please don't play, stop. And I think they ended up going home without being able to play. But one of the key things is the midnight deadline was very important, because this is the end of the first year of the Human Rights Council, so the membership is going to change. So if they don't pass it now after a year of discussion, you'll have a slightly different mix of countries, and everything will be reopened and have to be renegotiated. So a lot was on the line. Even though South Africa, Bangladesh, and the like all joined China in offering some resistance, not all of them backed down. It was only China that kept insisting that they didn't like this text. It got so bad that President de Alba started talking to journalists and had some draft news stories that it was showing China, saying, you're going to get some bad publicity for doing this. And that is largely what caused China to relent. And it shows you how much China does not like scrutiny that is trained on its record. So what was China's degree of success? I would say fairly successful. No membership criteria. So we still have a rogues gallery in some ways. We also have a larger body with representation for Asia and Africa. The organizational status remains below the Security Council. And then importantly for China, in the UN General Assembly resolution text, in numerous instances, it emphasizes dialogue and cooperation, which China loves. And dialogue and cooperation sounds great. And you can't really say I'm against dialogue and cooperation, but I think that the real risk is that you won't be able to use vigorous monitoring tools like calling for a special session, sending special procedures to investigate, and the like. China also prevented the complaints procedure, the subcommission, and the UPR from becoming stronger. And it also supported the elimination of special procedures on Belarus and Cuba. But importantly, it failed on the country resolution issue. It really wanted to kill any use of country resolutions, and that failed. But the special procedures have remained largely intact. So that is still a pretty vibrant part of the UN human rights system. And we still have a number of country-specific ones. But finally, I think the successes are not attributable at this point primarily to China. It was In the early stage, it was largely Pakistan and Russia, and then later it was the like-minded group and a subset of the developing world that helped shape the final text. So some concluding thoughts. As I mentioned, my research stops in 2017. It's actually around this time that China's stealth constrainer efforts maybe shift a little bit. Part of this is because, as I indicated, image often acted as an important restraint on China's behavior. This, over time, has become much weaker, and in the last 5 years, I've seen it become an even weaker constraint on China. So maybe China will be content to constrain or break the regime without having to use its stealth strategies. And then also, we see a very different China emerging, definitely since Xi Jinping came to power in 2013, but even more so in the last 4 or 5 years. And China at that point, during the period I reviewed, was successful mainly only when other nations took similar positions. I think that we would see a very different outcome now, where between the Belt and Road Initiative and other signs of China's economic and political prowess, China may be able to shape the outcomes in the Human Rights Council much more easily. And then, as I mentioned, because China is shifting to a much more muscular posture, one of the points I make often is that the world has not yet seen a muscular China in the international human rights regime, and I think we are about to. So we are probably going to see an unprecedented Chinese attack on the international human rights regime, partly because China previously was content to just resist, constrain, deflect attention. Numerous interviews told me China is mainly defensive during this period. We don't yet see China going out on the offensive yet, and I think that this marks a real change.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.